Do that. Hey, I'm excited that you're here. We're in this series we've called Lies Christians Believe. And that sounds a little funny when you say it that way, especially the one we're going to talk about today, because it sounds like something maybe Christians wouldn't believe, but I think we do. And I think, and I've said this, I think the reason I like this series right now so much is because no matter where you're at in your faith journey, and I know some of you still got a lot of questions. Like you're not even sure this whole God thing works out like everybody seems to say it works out. And maybe that's you. And if you're here because somebody drugged you this morning, hey, I hope it's not too painful, and I'm glad you're here, right? We invite the questions. Some of you, though, you've been walking with God for a long time. And here's the thing. No matter where you're at on that spectrum, I keep telling you that our behaviors really should come out of our beliefs, right? The things we believe should be the things that we base our behaviors in. If our beliefs are off, if we believe things that are not true, if we've been convinced about something that's a lie, even if it was never meant to deceive us, even if nobody told you this because they wanted to deceive you and lead you into some kind of giant untruth, but we believe something that's not a lie, you know what's going to happen? Our behaviors are going to be off. We're going to get frustrated. We're going to get frustrated because it seems like things don't work like they're supposed to. So wherever you're at in your journey this morning, I really hope that this will appeal to you, that you'll understand what we're talking about, and these lies are things that we need to try to undo. To start this morning, I want to do another quick survey because I like doing this. I like making you raise your hand, so I'm going to ask you to raise your hands in just a second. Don't get and listen. If you did this in junior high, like you always sat in the back of the class because the teacher was going to take a survey and ask for the right answer, A, B, C, who thinks it's A, and you waited to see who raised their hands before you raised yours. I don't want that this morning, right? I want you to be bold. You raise your hand when I ask you this question because I want you to be honest and I want everybody else to be honest and to see the honesty in the room. Here it is. Raise your hand for me if you've ever taken something to God, a hurt, a pain, a trouble, a problem, no matter what it is. You've taken something to God and you feel like, at least initially, that He didn't answer. That he turned his back on you, maybe he wasn't even paying attention, or maybe he didn't even care. Raise your hand if at any point in time in your life you've done something like that. You took something to God and you said, hey, He wasn't listening. Now, hold your hands up. I want you to hold them up. Don't be ashamed. This is not to hurt anybody. It's not to shame anybody. I want you to look around for just a second and look at the hands in the room. Okay, put them down. See, here's the thing. For most of us, when we get in a situation where we think God's not paying attention to us, you know what happens? We actually think we're alone. We start to feel like we're the only person around that this has ever happened to. That there's no way God ignores everybody else the way He seems to be ignoring me right now. And there's some things that actually escalate this for all of us, okay? Be honest. You escalate this in your own heart and your mind when what happens? When you have a friend that everything just seems to work out for. Right, you've got that friend, and they come to work, and here's the deal. You're praying about a job that you need, or a next level job because your family's not making enough money, or you're praying for a spouse because they've turned their back on God, or they're not happy in the marriage, or things just aren't going well, you're fighting all the time, or you're praying for a sick friend or a child. And you've got all of these hurts and these pains, and you keep taking them to God, and you look around, and it doesn't help when it looks like your friends all have the right jobs. Right? It doesn't help when you look around and it looks like your friends, all of their kids are in AP classes, including AP lunch. Right? That doesn't help your soul, right? All it does is build that thing in you that says, I'm alone in this whole thing. And then you start to think, look, God, why aren't you listening to me? Because I'm better than them. Be honest, be real honest now. You think this. Like, come on, they sleep in on Sundays. They played golf last Sunday. Right? They can't even make it to church on time. I'm there every week and I work with the kids. And yet you're not talking to me. And then it escalates even more on Monday morning because here's what happens. You're going to get to the office tomorrow and one of your friends is going to have slept late or slept in or their alarm went off or they're going to have some excuse. But here's the thing. They jumped out of bed and they threw some radical prayer to God, and lo and behold, every light between their house and the office was green that morning. And so they slid in just on time. And listen, they're not going to wait till lunch. They're going to start telling you about it right then. You're never going to guess this. Like I talked to God this morning, He totally answered my prayer. And you've got a spouse that's chronically sick. Or you've got a kid that's hurting in school. And they're going to keep telling these stories. In fact, it gets even better. They prayed when they hit the parking garage, and they got a front row parking place this morning, right? Or I always like it when they prayed because they wanted to get that stain out of their favorite t-shirt, and it miraculously disappears, right? And you got to hear those stories all day long. And then let me turn up the heat just a little bit more on me. Then when you do go to church, what happens? You listen to some pastor, some preacher who seems to make it sound like if life's not working, if I'm not having, my faith doesn't seem to be working, if I feel like God's not with me, then maybe there's just more sin I need to confess, or more hoops I need to jump through, or I need to do the 3 steps the pastor told me about last week. By the way, if you show up every week and you know that I don't like to necessarily always give you 3 steps, because if you did that, and let's say that you were here 50 weeks out of 52, I'm going to give them to you, okay? You wrestle with God about that. But if you're here 50 weeks out of 52 and I give you 3 steps every week, that's 150 steps in a year. And in 10 years, you're looking at 1,500 steps. Which one did you mess up? Why is God not listening to you? Why does God not really seem like He cares about you? Which hoop did you not jump through this week? And then here's what happens. When we start to think that God doesn't care about us, what we're really saying is He's not doing things the way I want Him to. He's not listening to me. What I'm really saying is He's silent. What I'm really saying is He's absent from my life. He's not there. God doesn't really care. And see, what we're doing is we're starting to expect and presume upon God that He should act towards us like we want Him to. Right? He should behave like we've expected other relationships to behave. So if you've got a friend who's ever lied to you or cheated on you, you know what you do? You kind of start to expect that God will lie and cheat on you as well. If you've got a friend who broke their promise to you, you kind of start to think that, well, maybe God's just like us anyway. Maybe He'll break His promise on me, and ultimately, God doesn't really care. I want to tackle this lie in quick fashion this morning, and I want to do it this way. For some of you, this might be like revolutionary stuff. It might be brand new, some of the thoughts I want to share with you. For some of you, you're going to say, I've heard this before. Now, here's the problem. You still are struggling to live in it. So I'm not giving you 6 steps this morning. I'm not giving you 10 steps. I'm going to invite us to look at the truth this morning and ask God, through His Spirit, to convince us of some things about Himself. I want us to look at the things that He says about Himself. Why? Because I don't want to stand up here and tell you, hey, I think God is this way, and that's why you should have faith. I think God is this way. I believe God is this way. I want to stand up here and explain to you how I've come to understand God to be through how He tells me He is, so you don't have to just believe me. And you can look at the verses and you can take them home and you can dissect them, you can pray about them, you can talk to other friends, but I want to talk to you about why God really does care and how we can bust this lie up in our own lives. We're going to talk about some of His attributes this morning, and I want you to begin to lean into these. That's what I would pray for you this week. First attribute, open your flyer. We're going to get right to it. The first attribute, it's a big word, write this down. God is omnipotent. God is omnipotent. You don't have to look it up, I'll tell you what it means. It means all-powerful. Right? Most of you probably knew that anyway. This is a smart group. That God is all-powerful. Now, that sounds pretty silly, right? It sounds elementary. I mean, if God really is God, then we kind of expect Him to be all-powerful, right? It just makes sense. You say God is God, then He must be powerful. But what does that mean for us? That if God really is all-powerful, if He has all of the power within His fingertips in the universe, then there's got to be some kind of assurance for us in knowing that's who He is. Not feeling that's who He is. You're going to hear me say this over and over again this morning. I'm not opposed to feelings. Emotions are a gift of God. But I'm asking you to understand and know something today. That if God is all-powerful, there must be some kind of assurance that comes out of that power. A few years back, when Sue and I were moving out of our apartment in San Antonio to come to Dallas to go to seminary, because I was the genius one who had the idea of going to grad school, and she was smiling and trying to act like she was on board, and prayerfully she was. We were moving out that day, and we were going to be very transient for the next several months. Nothing was set in stone. Except this one thing, that as we're in a car and we're driving away from our apartment in San Antonio, my lovely bride of 2 years looks to me and says, we need to stop by H-E-B because that's God's grocery store. Okay, if you've never been to H-E-B, go to South Texas. That's where the best are. She said, we got to stop at H-E-B. Okay, great. Why? I think we need a pregnancy test. Now, we did not need a pregnancy test. She needed a pregnancy test. And if you've heard me tell that story, here's the thing. For the next 5 years, because I crammed a 4-year degree in 5, for the next 5 years, we were on the most crazy journey that probably we've ever been on. Next to church planting. We were on this unbelievable journey. We were sleeping on people's floors for a while. We were driving around to interviews because neither one of us had jobs. And I'd only pull over long enough for my poor little bride to throw the door open and throw up out the car and then shut the door and we off to the next interview. We had to continually remind ourselves that God was omnipotent. Because can I tell you something? In the minute, in the moment, the circumstances didn't feel like he was all powerful. Because if he was all powerful, see, my thing is, if he's all powerful, then he could just like snap his fingers and there would be a job. We wouldn't have to go on 15 different interviews. I wouldn't have to drive my little pregnant sick wife all around town. See, if he's all powerful, then why don't things just work out the way I want them to? But this is not about me. This is about him. He is omnipotent. And regardless of my feelings or my circumstances, he's still omnipotent. How do I know that? Because that's what I'm taught. It's what I've come to see in life, but not necessarily because I felt it was that way or because I saw everything work out perfectly. I love it. Jesus is talking to his disciples in Matthew 19. And they're wrestling through this whole thing about how a person gets into eternity, right? How does a flesh and blood person actually have any kind of assurance of eternal life? And Jesus kind of looks at him, knowing who he is, and with, I'm sure, just a bit of a chuckle in his heart, he says to him, with man, this is impossible. You think you can beat the grave, right? Like, he must have just been thinking, you kids, stop being so idealistic. So stop speculating. You think in your own power you can beat the grave, and they're starting to realize, oh, we can't do that. Look what he says next. He says, but with God, all things are possible. All things. He says all things are possible. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say all things are probable. It's not that everything in your life that could come true, could come to pass, that you want to come to pass, is going to come to pass. Jesus says the greatest thing that God has power over is the fact that he can take your flimsy body and guarantee you a place in eternity. That's power. It's not based in changing your circumstances all the time. It's not based in changing the consequences of all of our decisions all the time. It's not based on removing us from all of the pain of this world in a moment. It's based in the fact that God can carry us into eternity. That the very thing mankind has no power to do, to give himself a place in eternity, God says, I can do that. That's my job. That's what I do. And I'm not being down on people. Listen, I love humanity. I love the sciences. If you don't read, I love to read in the medical field. And we've got Israel over here. Doctors are saying that within a year or so, they're going to have a cure for cancer. I don't know. That's what they're saying. We've got telescopes now that can give us images of things that are 15 trillion light years away. I don't even know what that number is. But we get pictures now. We can see things that we could never see before. Our capacity to build in this world is phenomenal. But be honest. Can you control eternity? Can you stand at the grave of a loved one and help them get back up? That's God. God is omnipotent. He has all power. And in that momentary spot you find yourself where your circumstances are just driving you nuts and you're squirming because it's not comfortable, you can stand in that moment and know that God is in control of all eternity. He is all powerful. Next attribute, keep moving. Psalm 139. I want to read you a section. David says, "Oh Lord, you've searched me and known me. You know when I sit down, when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all of my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. It's lofty. I cannot attain to it." Write this down. God is omniscient. God is omniscient. He's all-knowing. It's a strange quality for us to think about. David's starting to pay attention to it here, and he begins to write it down, and I love how the Spirit directs him, but he's writing this down. But for us, it's a strange quality, because I think for most of us today, if you say all-knowing, we tend to have this really horrible image in our mind of somebody watching out over us, just waiting for us to do wrong. And right now, we live in a generation more than ever where there's cameras everywhere, right? And these cameras are recording everything. I walked down an aisle at a grocery store the other day and looked up, and my picture was on this screen, and I thought, I didn't even know that was there. And somebody's always watching. And why are we putting those cameras there? We're not putting those cameras there so that somebody can take my sweet little picture and send it to me, right? We're putting those pictures there because we're looking for somebody to do something wrong. In our world, to be all-knowing, we just associate with that with getting caught by something. Right? It was a great quality when we assigned it to Santa, right? Especially if you got little kids. Oh, Santa knows what you're doing. He knows the good and the bad, right? Don't go there, but we say that, right? And what do? We created Santa so we can create Santa to do what we want Santa to do. He's going to give toys to the good, not the bad. We cringe at the thought sometimes of an all-knowing God. David says, I'm in awe. That before I even say it, before I even mess up, you knew. You say, well, how is that a good news? How is that something that we can celebrate, we can take comfort in? Because he knew all of that. And what? He still came to rescue us. See, it's all buried in that message that Jesus, when he walked this earth, and he walked up to that cross, and he got on it himself, and he died, and then he walked out of the grave, and all of a sudden we have the ability to know a God who says, I know everything, and I was still willing to do this for you. And now all we have to do is respond. David's impressed with that. He's astonished. You know me, God. Think about it. There are 7.5 billion people on this earth. 7.5 billion people. And to say that God is omnipotent means that God knows you as if you were the only person that had ever walked the face of the planet. And he knows every person that way. Your circumstances may leave you feeling very alone. God says you are never alone. Because he has the ability to know all. Paul kind of asserts this. You think, well, if God knows me, then he knows the good and the bad, right? Whatever the good is, for me, it's more bad than good. But he knows all of this stuff. And Paul kind of gives us some confidence about that. We don't have to fret over that. In Romans, he writes and talks about it. He says, look, we're all sinful. In other words, we've all missed the mark. None of us have behaved exactly like God designed us to behave. We've all turned our backs. We've all rebelled on God. So Paul kind of says, let's just own it together. Stop judging people. Just own it. You have messed up as much as anybody in this world. But here's the thing. To put your faith and trust in Christ is to have the confidence that God knows you. And that he still offers his love to you in that way. Jesus, I love what he says in Matthew 10. He's talking about this dilemma we find ourselves in, about the fears of this world. Look what he says in Matthew 10:28. He says, and don't fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Like, I know that you're aware of bad things going on in the world. I know that you're aware that there are people who would put you to death simply because of your faith in Christ or for some other goofy reason. And he says, don't worry. Don't worry about losing your body, right? Because God knows you. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. And are not two sparrows sold for a penny? He turns to this really quaint little illustration, a market illustration. He says, you've been to the market? They're selling these little sparrows for two for a penny. He says, God knows that when one of those dies, falls out of the sky, he knows about that. If he knows that much, and he's also saying he knows you. In fact, he even knows the hairs on your head, verse 30, verse 32. So everyone who acknowledges me before men, I will also acknowledge before my Father. See, God knows you. He just wants to know if you want to know him. That's the invitation. That's the confidence. God's all-knowing. No matter your circumstances, no matter what's going on in your life, you're never alone because he knows you. Let's keep going. We're going to go to Psalm 139. Verse 7. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, okay, it's the grave. If I go to the graveyard, you're going to be there too. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, if I could just fly away, verse 10, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall uphold me. Verse 11, if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night. Verse 12, even the darkness is not dark to you, the night is bright as day, for darkness is as light with you. Write this down. God is omnipresent. He's in all places. David says, I can't go anywhere. If I could wear wings and just fly wherever I wanted to go, if I went and buried myself in the ground, I just can't go anywhere that I could escape the knowing of God. He is everywhere. God is everywhere. And right now, please don't do this. I know you moms are sitting there going, boy, if I could do that, I could manage my house a lot better, right? You got 2 or 3 kids. You're looking to be, if you're thinking if I was at work and I could be everywhere, I could be in a couple meetings at once. But see, here's the thing. You couldn't. Because even if you could replicate yourself, what would happen? You need the ability to not just be there in bodily form. You need the ability to be there and be present. When God is everywhere, he's present everywhere. He's fully functional. He's fully God in that space. He can be involved with 7.5 billion people at one time. Think about that. Because the day is going to come, right? And probably is still here for most of us, where you got circumstances, you got consequences, you got things that are just weighing you down. You got things that are in your life that are hard. They're making you squirm. They make you feel uncomfortable. They make you feel alone. And yet David says, but here's what we know. He's everywhere. In the middle of whatever's going on in your life, he's there. So the circumstances, when they don't work out, when somebody still dies of cancer, when somebody still loses a job, when somebody still gets hurt in your family, when a relationship falls apart, God is still there. He's still present. And so many times we take those circumstances, those consequences, as a sign that God doesn't care. So he's omnipotent, he's all-powerful, he's omniscient, he's all-knowing, he's omnipresent, he's everywhere. And this last one, he's omnibenevolent. Omnibenevolent. He's all-loving. He's all-loving. Now, when I say that, I need you to understand something. It's not by accident that I think that one of the most quoted verses of our day is John 3:16. Right? For God so loved the whole world. I think we like the idea that God is a loving God. But we have to be careful. Why? Because what are we talking about? That so many times we expect him to behave as we would behave with each other, right? He is all loving. He is all loving towards every person who's ever walked this earth, will walk this earth right now, or ever will walk this earth. He's all loving enough that he initiated a plan to restore relationship. And I know, listen, theologians like to argue about all this stuff, but here's the thing. He is so loving that he sent his son to provide rescue, to provide restoration, to provide a way back. And when we put our trust in that plan, in that rescue, we can't do anything but begin to love the way he loves. That's what's so unique. 1 John 4, verse 7. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. I want you to take a pen. I want you to underline those last three words. God is love. And make note of this. God is love. It does not say love is God. You can't turn it back around. Because in our culture, we define love so many different ways. And most of the times we define love in the ways that we want to receive things or we want things to work out. And so it's our definition that messes things up. God is love in the purest sense. But all love, as we would define it, is not of God. And he makes this bold statement. And church, I know that we're still struggling with this today because even people who gather like this, we have to brutally admit that we have trouble loving people who don't have our best interest at heart. We have trouble loving people who try to take advantage of us, try to deceive us. We have trouble loving people who seem to be out for our destruction. And you can understand why. I don't want to be the pastor that stands up and says, oh, it's easy, you should just love people. No, it's hard. People are messy. Anybody got messy in your family? Don't raise your hands. Especially if the messy is sitting right next to you. Right? It's hard. The only thing that drives me, that motivates me, that still entices me, that still invites me to love people, even the people who don't love me, is this idea that God loved me. Even though he knew everything about me. Even though he's there when I do everything I do wrong. And even though he has the power to just walk right past me. God is omnipotent. He's omniscient. He's omnipresent. And he's omnibenevolent. To begin to know God in that way is to begin to understand that God really does care for you. Right? It begins to build my confidence. It doesn't always make me feel better. Right? Can we clarify that? There are still going to be days when nothing seems to go right. When you get up tomorrow morning, you got a flat tire. And if you're like me, it's always the little things. Like the big things I seem to do okay on. It's the little things. Flat tire, God's left the universe. Don't know where he is. He's turned his back on Cecil. It's to be expected. Right? That's how I think when I get in the moment, and I'm operating out of my feelings a lot of times. But when I can pause and focus on the things I know, this lie that God really doesn't care starts to fade away. Write this down. God hasn't forgotten you today. His truth reveals he is with you every day. He has not forgotten you today. His truth reveals, if we're willing to read it, if we're willing to investigate, if we're willing to stand on what we're learning, his truth reveals that he's with you every day. In spite of the mess, in spite of the turmoil, in spite of the pain. And he stands ready to one day do away with all of it. He is omnipotent, he is omniscient, he is omnipresent, and he is omnibenevolent. My circumstances do not dictate who God is. Who God is dictates, allows me to live above, walk through some bad circumstances. And the so what here this morning for all of us is is really one of a couple decisions. Right? For some of us, we've got to acknowledge that we've been just living in fear. That fear tends to invade our lives more than we want to admit because we have yet to know God in this way. And for some of us, it's okay. Listen, for all of us, it's okay. The question is, are you willing to admit it? Do you want to own it this morning? Because some of us need to take that initial step of saying, look, I've just never even known that God loved me to this degree. I didn't know that there was an opportunity. I didn't even know what He was inviting me into. So that may be your decision this morning. To begin to live into these 4 attributes of God is to begin to take that first step, put your faith and trust in Christ for the very first time. To say, Lord, look, I've been living my whole life for me because I've been trying to control all of these consequences, all of these circumstances. But I can't do it. And I own it now. I'm a wreck. If that's you, I'd invite you this morning just to have that conversation with God. There's no magic prayer. Just have that conversation with God for the first time. Invite Him to begin to reveal Himself to you. Ask Him for the power, the strength, the confidence to put that control that you have in His hands, to put your faith and trust in Him for the first time. Some of us, though, we've been walking with God for quite a while, and we keep wondering why we can't advance in our faith. We keep wondering why we get stuck. And the reality is, it's because we have not yet begun to live into the attributes of God. It's some of the simplest things, and for this I apologize if you have ever been a part of a church that you felt like just didn't teach you this, or maybe you were around other Christians and they'd never even talked about this stuff. For the body, can I say I'm sorry for the times that this was not clear enough. But God has given you opportunity, and so here we stand again at this point, and the question is, are you willing and ready to say, I want to know you in this way, God? I've seen the mess. I've seen how everybody else messes up things, and churches are messy because we're messy people, right? And that's okay. But where you are you willing to surrender your circumstances, surrender your consequences, surrender your life again? Keep walking and know God in a new and unique way through His attributes, through who He says He is, not through who your neighbor says He is. Let me pray for us.